Now, Spooderman Across the Spider-Verse Part 1 is coming out in June, and I, along with many other people, am extremely excited for it. Into the Spider-Verse is arguably the best Spider-Man movie ever made, and so naturally the sequel is going to be very highly anticipated. And so the trailer came out recently, which if you watched it, you probably thought, nice. Cool. And like me, you were probably wondering what Miles could have possibly done to piss off Oscar Isaac's character so much that he's chasing him on all fours. However, to some people, they were horrified. This trailer showed something really scary. There's a moment in the trailer where a sign can be seen in the background that reads, "Protect trans kids." How fucking horrifying, am I right? Well, the anti-fandom definitely thought so. But like, I was so shocked when I heard about this and went to actually find this moment myself, because I had to watch that trailer 3 fucking times, slowing it down to finally see this split-second moment where if you squint your eyes, you can see the sign. I don't know how this could offend someone so much. If anything, this isn't enough. It's almost like it's been hidden away, because many companies only like doing the bare minimum to be inclusive, just so they can say, hey, look how progressive we are, when in reality they're all pretty right-leaning because they're, well, businesses. I mean, if it was up to me, then I'd make the sign way more visible, throw that message right in people's faces, because this is an important message. But also, this is a trailer, so my critique isn't even relevant until the movie actually comes out. And this argument that the movie has now gone full woke and promotes underage transitioning is such a weird over-exaggeration, because that's just not what happens. It's a couple of frames where you can see it in the background. People act like this small detail that was probably included by the animating team is somehow a show of degeneracy, and it all boils down to this social panic surrounding the trans community from the right that is built solely on misinformation and delusion. Don't worry, we will directly engage with these arguments made by Eric July and also some of the more general anti-trans messages coming from influencers on the right, such as Matt Walsh. However, I thought I'd start by debunking a lot of the common misconceptions I see regarding the trans community and the treatment they receive, so that when we get to these examples, you all should understand why the arguments these people make are completely uninformed, ignorant, and potentially harmful towards trans people by further helping to create negative stigma surrounding gender-affirming care, transitioning, and social acceptance, which, as you will see, are the most effective ways of relieving the symptoms of gender dysphoria and making life better for trans people. However, before we get to that, I just wanted to mention DJ from Eric's Reloaded, who's a friend of the channel, and basically he recently did a passionate and really fucking solid rant on Eric July's ignorant video. The video is over on AirrickDebunks, which is DJ's new channel dedicated to dunking on people with dumb takes. If you're looking for more channels who are fighting back against the anti-fandom, then you should definitely check out his links down in the description. He is generally just a good and well-informed person. He also fully covers Eric's video, which I won't, so yeah, definitely check that out. I also want to acknowledge that I, as a straight white cis man, am coming at this topic from a place of privilege. If this is the first time you're hearing pro-trans arguments, then I implore you to go watch videos from trans creators, because while I can do my research and debunk anti-trans arguments, I can't speak for the trans community, and I don't want to do that. I will never be able to understand what it's like to be trans, to have gender dysphoria, to have to face discrimination and a lack of acceptance for who I am. I can try my hardest to understand and sympathize with these struggles, but if after this video you want to dive deeper into this topic and learn more about the trans community, then I really recommend going to check out channels like Jessie Gender and Mulder. And if you want specific videos, then I think these are a good place to start. They're both by Jessie Gender, and in the first one she dissects the terrible segment on transgender healthcare from the TV show 60 Minutes. It's a really informative video that I highly suggest watching when you have the time. And the second video is titled The Hell of Transgender Puberty, which is about Jessie's own experience with growing up trans and how negatively going through the wrong puberty affected her. The experiences she shares in this video are something that I will never be able to convey to you because I'm not trans. That doesn't mean that I can't still try to be an ally and debunk the ridiculous and malicious anti-trans arguments I see people make, because I think anyone can and should do that. You don't need to be trans to help defend trans people from ignorant and often malicious ideas and rhetoric. However, I can only speak alongside trans voices, I can never speak for them. So go check out these videos or this article if you're more into reading, to learn more about the trans community from people who are trans. It will provide a different perspective than the one I can give. Now, as I said earlier, I first want to delve into a general discussion about the trans community and the uninformed opinions many people have of it, because there's so much focus on protecting kids from trans ideology.
They are going after people's children. What should have been off limits, no matter where you're at ideologically, no matter where you're at politically or socially, it should have been understood that the kids stay out of that.
But this whole think of the children facade is completely fake and mischievous, because if these people genuinely cared about children, then they would be using facts about trans people and gender affirming care, which I'll get to now, rather than trying to speak to the feelings of their uninformed audiences. Because first of all, trans kids don't get bottom surgery. Usually when a child is showing symptoms of gender dysphoria, which is the distress that a person experiences due to the mismatch between their sex that was assigned at birth and their gender identity. And then they'll usually have multiple sessions with a professional psychologist and/or doctor. A common myth is that a child can just go down to a clinic and say, "Hey, I'm trans, give me hormone treatment," which is just plain wrong. A lot goes into making the decision to even suggest putting a child on puberty blockers. But once the child's symptoms have been addressed by said professionals, after many sessions, puberty blockers can then be prescribed because, again, most trans kids aren't medically transitioning. Puberty blockers are instead simply meant to slow down puberty until the individual reaches an age where they can make an informed decision about whether or not they want to transition. If they choose not to transition, then they'll stop taking puberty blockers and their puberty will happen after that. However, if the person does choose to transition and make efforts to align their body more with their gender, then they can begin gender-affirming procedures, whether these are hormone replacement therapy, top surgery, or bottom surgery. But please remember that bottom surgeries in most places aren't possible to undertake until you're over the age of 18, while HRT can be started at 16, the same age a person can learn to drive in America, as long as they consent to it, because believe it or not, a parent can't just force their kids into these procedures. The teenager needs to consent too. Now you may be wondering, why does a kid even need puberty blockers if they can just transition once they're of age? And that's because for a person with gender dysphoria, which again means that their internal perception of their gender doesn't correspond with their body or the social expectations they face, going through the wrong puberty can cause a lot of distress. However, I don't know what this distress is really like, so I'm going to show a segment of Jessie Gender's video because she actually lived through this distress and therefore knows exactly why puberty blockers are needed. She also just explains this way better than I could.
For example, one of the biggest ones is a drug called puberty blockers, or at least the colloquial term for them. Safe drugs, for the most part, that with a doctor who has long and honest conversations with these kids, and hopefully parents of these kids, about the risks and their child's feelings, can pause puberties and allow kids the time to wrestle with their feelings and then decide when they're ready and of an age that, they can consent to it and fully understand the implications of it, choose which puberty they wish to go with. One that aligns with the gender that they are. Either one that is through their own bodily processes or through hormones, drugs is given to them by their doctor. Yet these puberty drugs have been the center of another culture war in our society. One centered on politicizing trans people and trans-affirming care for all trans people, but especially kids, in order to win votes and create another culture clash between two sides, when there are kids in the center of this. And I don't mean to think of the children, that sort of thing, but I'm just annoyed that we are talking about the culture clash, the gender ideology, the transes, rather than actually listening to what kids are feeling, what they're going through. We're so quick to use kids as our weapons in this war, but we don't really listen to them, do we? And we're so quick, because of this culture war, through anti-trans legislation and judicial action, to take away these drugs and these affirming cares for many kids in both the United States and the UK and elsewhere. And it's forcing many of these kids to go through the hell that I went through, forcing them to fight those monsters all by themselves. When we have the chance to help them in that fight, to give them a choice, to allow them to have that moment where they have to choose a path further down the line, to think about that choice instead of being forced down one of them, forced down a path that they don't want to go down.
I'd also highly recommend this video by Mulder, where she gives a complete overview of what puberty blockers are, why they're needed, and how they're used. She also debunks a lot of common myths surrounding the trans community, trans kids, and detransitioning. But so please listen when people say this. No one here is mutilating children. These surgeries and procedures, most of the time except for specific circumstances, are not done on children. And when they are performed, they're always made based on the informed decisions of multiple medical experts, as well as the consent of the individual. Helping transgender kids with their gender dysphoria by providing them with hormone blockers is not mutilation. It's giving the individual the means to live their life in a meaningful way, a way that aligns more with who they are. And there are restrictions on what gender-affirming care underage people can receive compared to adults. Now there's also the argument of chemical castration that's being spread around by people like Matt Walsh. The argument goes that puberty blockers that teens are put on, again to halt their puberty until they can make an informed decision about transitioning, are causing chemical castration. This does sound scary, I know, which is why this idea is being pushed by people who don't understand what puberty blockers actually are. The Republicans making these claims want to create a moral panic. However, this idea is incredibly reductive. Essentially, puberty blockers have been used medically since the 1980s for a condition called precocious puberty, where puberty begins in a child long before they are a teenager. And so this medicine blocks the chemical signals that release certain hormones that flood the body during puberty, which is why they can also be used to reduce the libido in a process known as chemical castration, which is sometimes used on sex offenders. It's used precisely because it is reversible, just in case they were wrongfully convicted. However, this is for incredibly high doses that will never be prescribed to anyone outside of that context. This is how all medicine works. One of the integral parts of the testing phase of medicine is testing out what the maximum dosage is, as well as what the optimal dosage is. Most medicine that you take will probably have some really negative side effects if you take too much of it. A simple painkiller can alleviate your headache, but if you take 20 of them, then you'll likely die. It's no different to giving warfarin to someone with a heart condition, even though it's used as rat poison. This argument is misinformed. Puberty blockers are safe. They don't cause any significant or irreversible side effects other than calcium deficits, which is quite rare and can be treated with supplements. If you want a video that goes way more in depth with puberty blockers and why they're safe and effective, then again check out this video by Mulder. It's a really good video. However, the main reason why so many people are afraid of trans people or afraid of their children becoming trans is because they don't know what these concepts actually mean, and I don't blame them. If they're watching Fox News all day and seeing tweets by Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro on Twitter, then of course they're going to believe this. Naturally, the facts don't care about your feelings. Dude knows exactly what he's talking about when it comes to trans people, just like the renowned scientist, who by the way never went to college. You see, these influential people continuously lie about the trans community, and sadly I think a lot of people will keep blindly hating on and causing panic about trans people because they stay uninformed and ignorant, while believing that they indeed are well informed. We'll get more into the politics of it all later, but I still want to mention a couple of things. Firstly, you may have heard the misinformed belief that being trans is a mental disorder, and that gender dysphoria is simply a disease like, say, depression that needs to be counteracted. This topic is, however, a lot more nuanced than that. Yes, gender dysphoria needs to be addressed because the distress that patients feel can be incredibly difficult to live with, and even lead to suicide, especially in households and communities where they aren't validated and affirmed in the gender they identify with. Gender dysphoria is real and it's dangerous, but the absolute best way to treat gender dysphoria is social and physical transitioning. Now, I've ranted for a while about why anti-trans ideas are stupid and misinformed, but let me just show you some studies and statistics about trans people that support my arguments, because as much as people like Eric July and Matt Walsh like to talk about trans children, this issue concerns all trans people, not just children. Children are just an easy way of morally grandstanding.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
But don't for a second believe that these people don't simply just hate trans people in general. Also, all the studies I mentioned will be down in the description. But first, here's a list of scientific and medical organizations in America that affirm the validity of transgender people. Essentially, this means that being transgender is not seen as an illness, that trans people are deserving of respect and equal rights, and that there is a distinction between sex and gender. I'd highly recommend going to these websites and educating yourself more on the topic of trans people. However, here's our first study, and it's a meta-analysis on transgender people and the effect gender transition has on their mental health, which found that out of 56 studies, 52 of them indicated that transitioning has a positive effect on the mental health of trans people, and only 4 of these studies indicated that transitioning had mixed or no results on well-being. However, it needs to be noted that none of these studies found negative results of gender transitioning and the effect on well-being. This evidence is overwhelmingly positive, and it pretty much shatters any claim that gender transitioning doesn't have a positive effect on the mental health and well-being of trans people. However, I will keep going because the evidence really is one-sided. Next up, we have a longitudinal study on the effectiveness of puberty suppression and sex reassignment surgery on trans individuals in improving mental outcomes. These results were unambiguously positive, indicating that puberty suppression, support of medical professionals, and sex reassignment surgery have significant beneficial outcomes to the mental health and productivity of trans individuals. This next study is another meta-analysis that, granted on the basis of studies with limited methodologies, still found that in people who underwent sex reassignment surgery, 80% reported improvements to their gender dysphoria, 78% reported significant improvements in psychological symptoms, 72% reported significant improvements in sexual function, and 80% reported improvements to their well-being. Again, very positive results, indicating that transitioning is a great way to relieve symptoms of gender dysphoria, as well as making the lives of trans people better. Next, children who socially transition, again this is not physical transitioning, it's social transitioning, report levels of depression and anxiety which closely match levels reported by cisgender children, as in children who are not transgender, and these results are compared to children before social transitioning, where these levels of depression and anxiety are a lot higher. And so these results indicate that social transition massively decreases the risk factor of both anxiety and depression in trans children. Next up, the study concludes that transgender people generally have lower quality of life than cisgender people. However, this quality of life does drastically increase after gender-affirming treatment. And on the other hand, abuse, discrimination, and a lack of acceptance are among the many reasons why trans people commit suicide at much higher rates. So it can be deduced that discrimination and a lack of acceptance causes more psychological harm to trans people, and that acceptance, as well as social and physical transitioning, instead benefit the mental health, well-being, and quality of life for trans people. It's also relevant to state that the rate of regret for people who have undertaken gender-affirming surgery is much lower than that of commonplace surgeries. This rate of regret for transitioning is more or less around 1%, and the rate of detransitioners is not very high. And a lot of the people who do decide to detransition often do it to reasons other than regret, those mainly being social reasons such as lack of parental support or social shaming, or financial reasons in that the procedures were simply too expensive for them. So it seems that gender-affirming care of any kind, whether it be physical or social in the case of children, is not only beneficial to the child and helps alleviate symptoms of gender dysphoria, but is also safe and has a low rate of regret. To summarize, there is a plethora of evidence that exists about transgender people being valid, that transitioning both socially and physically is the best way to treat gender dysphoria, and that acceptance of trans people is directly linked to better quality of life and lower rates of suicide for trans people, including trans children, while a lack of acceptance as well as abuse and discrimination will have the complete opposite effect. Oh, and let's not forget the fact that these gender-affirming procedures like HRT and surgery are safe, professionally mediated, and aren't done on children, except for puberty blockers and social transitioning, which are also safe and professionally mediated. However, despite this evidence, many people still believe that transgender people are wrong and that children are suffering because of it, and that people who transition are just delusional. And it's because so many people don't know about this evidence. They haven't been taught, or they haven't read any of it, and that's what happens when the other half of the political spectrum has leaders who simply don't give a flying fuck about trans people or LGBTQ+ people in general. I'm almost positive that people like Ben Shapiro or Matt Walsh know what they're doing. They know that sex and gender aren't the same thing. They know that transgender people aren't even remotely as dangerous as they make them out to be. And they know that all this evidence exists that completely counteracts all their arguments. This is why they try to instill distrust towards the state and universities and scientific organizations, because they need their audience to believe that all the evidence that proves them wrong is fake. It's fucking cowardly. And this is all in an attempt to gain power. They don't care who they fuck over. If they have a chance to discriminate against trans people and to make the lives of these people worse, just to gain a little bit more power and money from their ignorant supporters, then they'll do it without hesitation. And so that brings us to this video by Eric July titled, "This is not a laughing matter. Trying to normalize bad behavior." And remember, this is all because of a sign in the background of a trailer that says protect trans kids. Apparently wanting to protect trans kids by trying to create a society in which they won't be discriminated upon based on their gender identity, and by preventing them from hurting themselves or being hurt by others through acceptance and acknowledgement, is somehow normalizing bad behavior. And trust me, the reasoning he uses in this video doesn't justify him saying this whatsoever. However, I want to start by saying that Eric July has been milking this. His first video on the topic made like double his usual views, and since then he has already made multiple more videos about it. He just sees this as an opportunity to shit on people, letting his fans go comment on the videos of the people calling him out, and as an opportunity to make a lot of money by shitting on trans people. And by the way, you can tell that this is all just a money-making opportunity for him, because despite naming his video, "This is no laughing matter," he's laughing at the start of his video.
Now, I know this is going to be one of those where people are like, oh, you're just ragging on this because
this topic is not serious to him. He's not actually concerned about anything. He just sees an opportunity to make money. Because we all know that channels like these don't actually want anything to change. They don't want to get rid of LGBTQ+ representation in media, because then what the fuck would he make videos about? His comic book is literally built on the fact that it destroys woke comic books. Without these things, he'd be no one. No one would care about him. However, he'll still spread lies and misinformation in his videos, saying things that can genuinely put trans people in danger because they're being framed as child mutilators. But let me just show you some examples. And again, check out DJ's video or this video by Cirrus if you want more in-depth coverings of this video, because I'll really only be showing his overall arguments, not going in depth with every claim he makes. The links are in the description.
Look, I hate that this is a conversation that we have to have a discussion about, but it is a very serious one because you have people that are actively acting as if this is something that needs to be normalized. And that is child mutilation. That is doing things to their bodies that is irreversible. When you talk about like double mastectomies, which absolutely is happening to young people, like this is stuff that is irreversible. Even some of the like hormonal or puberty blockers and all that, it has the side effects that can absolutely have issues, let's say that.
Alright, he says a lot right here, so I'll take it piece by piece. First of all, you don't hate that we need to have this discussion, because this is how you make money. Let's not trick your audiences into believing that the reason you're making this video is because you genuinely care about the children in question, when it's really because it makes you a lot of money. We can see your insincerity from a mile away. You also target the notion that, quote, this is something that needs to be normalized, which it absolutely is. It makes no sense for you to disagree with this. Sometimes kids are gay, sometimes kids are trans. There's nothing wrong with this, and by creating accepting and affirming social spaces for these kids, it will allow them to explore who they are in an environment that's safe. Again, let me go back to the evidence that social and physical transitioning, as well as affirming social spaces, greatly improves the well-being of trans people and especially trans kids, while views like yours that promote unacceptance and prejudice are part of what reduces psychological well-being for trans kids and can lead them to hurt themselves. And that's why protecting trans kids is a message that should be normalized. You also mentioned that puberty blockers are irreversible, but you give no evidence. You mentioned that young people get irreversible surgeries, but you show no evidence. And listen, we can get into the discussion of top surgery or double mastectomies if you want, but it's a pretty common surgery done on teenagers who have, for example, breast cancer, and even for teenagers whose breasts are too large. At the end of the day, top surgery is cosmetic and it can be reversed. Bottom surgery, on the other hand, is a whole other discussion, but bottom surgery is not done on kids. It's the lack of understanding towards the topic that Eric makes a living off of that really baffles me. You also mentioned that the quote hormonal stuff can absolutely have issues, but you don't explain what, how, or why. You literally just use your ignorance towards trans issues, gender dysphoria, and gender-affirming care to say shit like child mutilation, because this is what your conservative fanbase already believes in. I mean, who needs evidence when you can just lie about all the scary stuff being done to children?
And people, I mean, at minimum, even if, no matter who you are, at minimum, we should be able to accept that, look, the children should stay away from that. This is not something that needs to be, if they want to make that decision as an adult, you can, of course, are free to disagree or agree with it. However, you know, that's their ultimate decision to make as an individual and as an adult. That doesn't mean everybody has to agree with it. That doesn't mean everybody has to like it. They can think you're a fool, but it's your body. And if you want to do something goofy like that, that's your business. But that's not what it is that we're discussing. And that's not the angle that these people are taking. They are going after people's children.
No one is going after people's children. No one is forcing children to take puberty blockers and go through transitioning. I mean, you can probably find a couple of examples of this, but you can find examples for everything. However, the large majority of people who advocate for trans rights are not trying to force people into becoming transgender. It's about making life better for people who are trans, including children who often from a pretty young age have an understanding that there's a disconnect between their gender and the sex that they were assigned at birth, as well as the social norms that they have been assimilated into due to their assigned sex. You're saying keep children out of it as if the reason trans kids exist is because adults are forcing them into it through their trans ideology, and not because trans kids simply exist, which is the truth of the matter. It's not about bringing children into it. Trans children are already in it. It's now about making life better for trans kids. And also, I like that you say that it's fine for adults to be transgender because it's their choice, but you constantly use words like weirdos, goofy, disgusting, and worst of all, degenerates, which is a word that has very often been used to label and outlaw minorities. So at least stay true to what you believe. If you hate trans people, then say it like it is, because obviously you do. Don't try to do this moral bullshit of simply caring about the children, because while you might be fooling your audience, you're not fooling me.
It's not just normalization through culture, but they're using children to validate themselves and their line of thinking. And that's where it becomes disgusting. There's no such thing. When I hear people, the fact that we're even having this discussion, trans kids, that's not a such thing, dude. That is not a such thing. And to see people try to gaslight, I talk about this on the Blaze all the time. This is the last point I'm gonna mention. It's insane how people have, we've allowed these weirdos to try to weaponize self-harm. Even though the data does not even show that once they transition, it's not, let's say, having an impact on how they feel about themselves in that regard.
Okay, there's again a lot to cover here, but starting off, you saying that transitioning has no impact is just plain wrong, and all the scientific consensus that exists supports that you're wrong. You give no evidence yourself because you know that there is none that's substantial enough for you to make a claim like this. You don't use evidence because you know all the evidence would completely annihilate any argument you're trying to make. You're just wrong. You also say that there's no such thing as trans kids, which again is just plain false. Where the fuck do you think trans adults come from? Most of them have been trans since they were young. You think people just decide to be transgender one day? Well, actually, you probably do, but you are also extremely ignorant because that's just not the case. You don't choose to be trans, it's who you are. And kids can be trans too. Again, all the evidence completely shatters your arguments. But lastly, you claim that people just use kids to validate themselves being trans, as well as their lines of thinking. But as I've mentioned many times already, and I'll gladly mention again to get it through your thick skull, it's not about making kids trans or using kids to morally grandstand. It's about protecting trans kids from discrimination and trying to build a world where they can grow up and explore their identities in a safe and affirming environment, where they're not going to be judged, harassed, or hated for being who they are. This is what you stand for. Everything that is making life hard for trans kids, that's what you're doing. So yes, Eric, you're making lives worse for children. Think about that the next time you try to claim you care about them. Alright, I think that's all I'll say for Eric and why his video is not only ignorant, but also promotes harmful anti-trans ideas. However, next I want to get into a more general discussion about the discourse surrounding trans people, and I want to mention the recent school shooting in Nashville, because as you probably know, the shooter was trans, and this led to a lot of discourse. And I just want to start off by saying that we should in no way try to protect the shooter, just because they're trans, which is something I saw a little bit of when this happened. This person is a murderer who killed children. That is unforgivable, and I don't think anyone should be trying to defend this person, even if there are good intentions in trying to protect the trans community. However, there is no need to protect the shooter in any way. You can of course tell people to use the right pronouns because that's just the truth, and people who purposely misgender the shooter are just weird and dumb. And listen, the fact that the shooter is transgender does not say anything about the trans community, and anyone trying to say that trans people are violent and mentally deranged people who cause a lot of shootings, which we will see examples of people saying, are all fucking dumb. If you look at any statistics, you will see that trans shooters don't even make up a fraction of mass shooters in America. Just because one trans person is a fucking piece of shit who murdered children doesn't mean that trans people are in any way more inclined to be mass shooters than anyone else. And that's what we need to focus on, standing with the trans community and trying to educate more people about the discriminatory and violence-inducing language of Republicans, not defending a school shooter. Nothing can forgive shooting innocent children. I know most of you already know this. I'm just trying to make it clear to anyone who's either trying to defend the shooter or anyone saying that the left is trying to defend the shooter just because they're trans. This is not the case. So again, our goal is to not defend the school shooter whatsoever, which really wasn't happening all that much anyways, but our goal is to stand with the trans community and do our part to try and protect the trans community from people who are taking advantage of this tragedy for their own political and social gain. The reaction from Republicans has been fucking disgusting, and I've seen people making the argument that, well, the left always cares about the identity of the shooter when it's a white male, but now that they're trans, they're trying to hide it. And this is not the case. The reaction from the left to this tragedy is the same that it is every time a mass shooting happens in America, which is pretty fucking frequently. And this reaction is to call for gun regulation. Now, I'm not American. I don't understand the obsession with guns. If this was a perfect world, you could just get rid of all guns in America and I'd be happy. However, I don't think that's possible in a country where guns are so important to the culture and where there are more guns than people. I think outright banning all guns would cause a lot of chaos and it just wouldn't be practical. There are also a lot of other systemic issues in America that can contribute to shootings as well, such as poor mental health resources, poverty, and discrimination. However, there is one reason why the US has hundreds of times more mass shootings than other westernized countries who also have issues with mental health, poverty, and discrimination, and that's guns, specifically assault weapons. And there are such obvious steps that can be taken to reduce gun violence. For example, making it more of a tighter process to get a gun and a license instead of simply being on a waiting list, which is the case in most places, or requiring better storage of the weapon so that children can't just go take their parents' guns and shoot each other with. But the most obvious one would be to ban assault weapons because no one needs a fucking assault rifle. I don't care who you are. Listen, I'm not even American, but there are such obvious changes that could be made to prevent all this fucking violence and death. But do Republicans want to do any of these? Well, of course they fucking don't. They'd rather keep giving out their thoughts and prayers to all the families of school shooting victims while they collect their fat checks from the NRA than try to push for legislation that could actually fix any of these problems. Every time there's a school shooting, they either want teachers to carry guns too, which is fucking idiotic, or they say that it's due to mental health issues, but then they block all attempts at making mental health resources better and more accessible. And of course, they don't even want to mention any form of gun control unless it's of course a trans person carrying the gun. This is where the fucking hypocrisy comes from. However, I want to end off by showing you this tweet from Matt Walsh because it's really fucking disgusting. I came to the conclusion years ago that the trans movement is the greatest evil our country faces. I only become more and more sure of this fact with each passing day, and more determined to oppose it until my last breath. This language is directly labeling trans people as evil. Matt Walsh is trying to remove the humanity from trans people so that his supporters begin to stop viewing the trans community as human beings, but rather as a threat. This is incitement to violence. I don't care if you think otherwise. Eventually, people who believe this will want to rid the world of trans people, because who wouldn't want to rid the world of evil? This can have serious consequences. Rhetoric like this can end up getting trans people killed. And Eric July calling the trans community rot and cultural decay?
This is right. Rot. It's cultural decay that you're sitting here watching.
As well as child mutilators, is completely guilty of this himself, along with every other big online personality taking part in anti-trans hate. They're not directly calling for violence, but they're helping to instill the delusional ideas that trans people being validated and accepted is somehow wrong and the same thing as child mutilation. These delusional, sick, hateful fucks would rather have every trans child in the world kill themselves just so that they can stand proud and say that they've saved children. But in reality, this is not about protecting children. This is about getting rid of trans people. Anyways, that's all I have left in me. At the end of the day, trans people are just trying to live their lives without being harassed, discriminated against, and mistreated by insecure yet powerful people, so we need to take a stance and actively combat this kind of harmful and hateful rhetoric. We need to stand with the trans community. However, go subscribe to this channel if you want to help support me, as well as subscribing to AirrickDebunks, Actual Fandom, Organized Chaos, the Fandom Initiative, as well as all the other great channels on this platform who make pro-LGBTQ+ content. Please support the good guys. I'm gonna end off with this segment from Jessie's video because I just love it so much. I hope you all have a wonderful day, stay safe and peace out.
Or maybe it's not about giving them puberty blockers at all. Some trans kids won't need them. Maybe it's just someone who will listen to them, like a doctor or mental health professional, giving them access to that, who can tell them that the monster and them aren't one and the same. Or for some trans kids who don't have that gender dysphoria monster, but maybe another type of monster, but are still trans nonetheless, just need someone to listen to them, beyond the endless cycle of the culture war. Someone who actually hear what they're saying. So, I hope one day we can create a world where that kid sitting in that doctor's office looking at that checkbox doesn't have to listen to that monster. That instead, they'll feel the safety to check that box and ask a question, and that someone will have the grace to answer it with care and honesty, and maybe give them the tools they need to fight back.